The smoke was still rising from the chamber floor when I realized I was the only one still breathing. I did not move. For 11 seconds, I counted them, deliberately, one after another, the way I had been trained to count under pressure, each number held in the mind. Long enough to be real, my training said. To assess before acting, so I lay flat against the cold titanium wall and I counted, and the air filled with the smell of burned circuitry and something else I chose not to name, and I kept counting until 11 was done. The lights overhead had cracked. 2 of the 4 panels were dark, one was flickering in an uneven rhythm, and the light it threw on the walls gave the room a strange underwater quality, like the interior of something that had recently stopped being alive. The conference table, which had seated 22 people 40 seconds ago, was no longer a table in any useful sense. The walls on the far side of the chamber had taken significant damage. The air recycling system was still running. I could hear it, the faint mechanical hiss of a station that did not know yet what had happened inside one of its rooms and did not particularly care. I am Najuro. I hold the rank of Staff Sergeant in the United Nations Diplomatic Security Corps. Before that assignment I served 8 years in Earth's Unified Ground Forces with 4 deployments to active tension zones and 1 posting to a joint Human-Earth coordination team that taught me more about patience than anything else in my career. I have been trained for situations that most soldiers would never encounter in 5 full careers combined. I have qualified on 6 weapon systems, 2 of which are no longer in standard service because better ones replace them. I have completed 3 zero-gravity combat certifications and 1 hostile environment survival qualification that I earned on a research station with a compromised atmosphere where the temperature dropped 11 degrees over the course of the exercise. I survived a decompression event at 30,000 m that took 2 of my colleagues from me in under 4 seconds, and I wrote the incident report 2 days later with steady hands because the report needed to be accurate, and accuracy required steadiness. I am not someone who panics, but I had never watched an ambassador die before. Vera Osmensa was 61 years old. She had spent 40 years in diplomatic service, 30 of them in deep space negotiations, covering 6 different species and 4 separate territorial disputes that might otherwise have become something worse than disputes. She spoke 4 alien languages with enough fluency that non-human delegates had complimented her accent, which is an almost impossible thing to achieve and which she's received with characteristic grace, deflecting the compliments with a quiet observation that language was the least of what needed to be understood between species. She wore her silver hair close to her head. She favored dark formal wear and deep tones that read well under the spectrum-wide lighting of alien hosted diplomatic spaces. She never raised her voice in a meeting. Not once. Not in 40 years. Not even when the people across the table had given her every reason. I had been her personal security lead for 14 months. It was the most specific professional relationship I had experienced in my career. Sustained close-order dynamic of protecting a single individual over an extended period. In that time I had learned her habits and her preferences, and the precise quality of her attention when she was genuinely considering something against the different quality it held when she was being polite. I had Watched her work in 6 different negotiating environments with delegations ranging from broadly cooperative to actively hostile, and I had never seen her become less than fully present. She brought everything she had to every session. She did not coast. She did not manage. She engaged. She was the best person at her job that I had ever been close enough to observe. She was standing 2 m ahead of me when the charge detonated. The Catherine delegation had arrived at Orvith Station 4 days before the summit was scheduled. To begin, Orvith is a neutral, administrative platform jointly managed by 3 non-human species, positioned in unclaimed space at the geographic boundary between human-controlled systems and the outer edge of the Kirin. Hej's territorial, it had been purpose-built for exactly this kind of use, the hosting of conversations that neither side wanted to have on their own ground in a space that neither side owned, administered by parties with no formal stake in the outcome. The corridors were wide and the ceiling heights were calibrated to accommodate multiple physiologies. The air mix was adjustable by wing. The station smelled in the human wing like recycled atmosphere and old metal, and in the shared corridors it carried the faint chemical trace that Kethon biology produces at rest, which I had been told was the rough equivalent in their sensory experience of the way they perceived human perspiration. We had been invited. That fact seems simple, but it carries everything. The Catherine security minister, a figure named V. Theron, who held one of the highest ranked positions in the hegemony's internal security structure, had sent a private encrypted transmission to Earth's outer system diplomatic office 8 weeks before the summit. The transmission had been short, precisely worded, and delivered through a relay chain that indicated the sender had gone to some effort to ensure it was not logged through standard hegemony communication infrastructure. It said that certain elements within the hegemony's leadership were prepared to discuss a framework for reducing automated border incidents, and that a direct in-person meeting would carry a different and more meaningful weight than anything achievable through relay-based negotiation. Ambassador Osmondsa had read that transmission 3 times before she formally accepted. I know this because she told me. She told me over dinner the night before our departure, sitting across a small table in her residential office with a cup of tea she had not touched and a view of the orbital curve of Earth below the station window. She said she was not certain the invitation was genuine, that there were elements of the communications timing and specificity that she had examined carefully and found either very promising or very concerning, and that she had not been able to determine with full confidence which one. She said that it did not matter practically, because if there was any realistic possibility that it was genuine, she was obligated to be present. That showing up was a fundamental requirement of the work, regardless of the uncertainty attached to any particular showing up. She said that diplomacy was at its core the repeated decision to be present at places where your presence was not guaranteed to produce anything. I believe that. I still believe it. I am not sure anymore that I believe it. Cleanly, the summit chamber on Orvith Station seated 22, our delegation had 7 members, including Ambassador Osmondsa and myself. The Kethin delegation had 6 formal members plus Vithan himself, who occupied the head position at the far end of the long, formal table. He was a large figure by Kieran's standards, which meant he was nearly my height, with the broad flat skull structure and the 3 pairs of eyes that were the distinguishing feature of Keth Aaron Highcast biology. Each pair of eyes operated somewhat independently of the others, giving them a continuous multi-angle awareness that was in my early days working in alien adjacent security environments deeply disorienting to be subject to. I had grown accustomed to it by the time of the Orveth summit, but I never entirely stopped noticing it. V. Thorin had said almost nothing during the first 2 sessions of the summit. He watched and he processed and he waited. The formal exchanges were handled by a mid-ranked delegate on his side who spoke standard English with a precision that suggested extensive training. Ambassador Osmintse conducted those exchanges with the same focused patience she brought to every session, testing the edges of the framework proposal, establishing what the other side was genuinely willing to discuss versus what was being presented as a position for negotiating purposes. She had done this in 5 previous interspecies negotiations, and she was exceptionally skilled at distinguishing the real from the performed. I stood at the rear wall, 2 meters behind and slightly to the right of Ambassador Osmintse's position. This was my standard placement for a closed session. I was not armed with a projectile weapon because the station's mutual safety agreement signed by all parties before the summit prohibited that. I carried a short-range electronic disruption device on my belt designed to interrupt active electronic systems within a 3-meter radius. It was intended for emergency situations involving automated threats, rogue systems, or unauthorized recordings. It would do nothing against a contact-fused plasma charge hidden beneath the surface of a conference table. That is not a criticism of the agreement. The agreement was reasonable. Given every realistic threat model, the charge had not been part of any realistic threat model. I do not know precisely when the charge was placed. Station security determined later, through structural analysis, that it had been installed inside the table for a minimum of 36 hours before the summit began. This meant it had been placed during the setup and inspection window, before any summit day protocols were active. Someone with access to the station's maintenance systems had been involved. The station administrative council began an investigation. The investig produced partial answers. The full picture of how access had been obtained was never completed because subsequent events made the logistics of how it happened less immediately relevant than the fact that it had happened. Vera was mid-sentence. She was presenting the 3rd section of the ceasefire framework, the section covering automated border patrol protocols, the specific language governing how each side's unmanned monitoring systems would behave within a mutually established boundary zone. It was detailed technical language, the kind that sounds dry to anyone not invested in it and carries enormous practical weight to everyone who is. She had just used the phrase mutual withdrawal distance, and she was about to explain the specific measurement criteria when Varen moved. It was a small motion. He leaned back in his chair just slightly, in a way he had not moved during the 2 full days of preceding sessions. I noticed it because I had been watching him with sustained, trained attention, and I knew his sitting posture as thoroughly as I knew anything about the Catherine delegation. He leaned Back, his upper pair of eyes shifted, very briefly away from Vera and towards something on the far wall that was not there. It was a change in his expression, in the way his facial structure held. That was not a shift into alertness or engagement. It was a shift into what I can only describe as removal, as if he had already left the room while his body remained in it. The flash was white and completely without direction. It came from everywhere simultaneously, from the table's surface, from the floor, from the space between the two sides of the table. The light had a physical weight to it that I did not expect, a pressure that moved through the air ahead of the sound followed by a fraction of a second, and it was not the rolling, expanding sound of an explosion in open space. It was contained by the walls, and the containment gave it a sharp final quality, like a single decisive word spoken in an empty room. The wall strut saved me. A structural support ran along the rear wall at shoulder height, part of the original load-bearing framework of the Orv Station summit wing. The detonation pushed it outward and down at an angle, and it caught me across the chest and drove me sideways and down behind a secondary wall panel that folded with the impact. The force was enough to fracture 2 ribs on my left side. The panel above me held. I did not know why it held until later, when the station engineers told me that particular section of the rear wall had been reinforced during a renovation project 3 years before the summit. Reinforcement that had never been entered into the official structural schematics. V. Thorin's team in their planning had used the current schematics. The gap between the document and the reality had been 9 cm of additional structural material. 9 cm. That is what remained of me. Vera was not behind a reinforced panel. She was standing 2 meters ahead of me in the open space of the chamber, presenting the section on mutual withdrawal distance to a man who had made the decision before she walked into the room that she would not leave it. I lay on the floor for 11 seconds. I counted each one deliberately, not because I was paralyzed, but because the decision to count was the decision not to react. Before I had assessed, then I got up. The hardline terminal was recessed into the rear wall behind a safety cover, with a handle pull exactly where the station security briefing had placed it. Physical connection, no wireless component, designed for use in environments where electromagnetic interference had compromised or might compromise active communications. I had been given its exact location in my first hour on Orvith Station, as I was given the location of every hardline terminal in every facility I worked in, because that was the kind of briefing that kept people operational when everything else stopped working. My hands were steady. I want to be precise about that because it matters, not because it reflects well on me, though it reflects training, but because what I did next required steadiness, and I want you to understand that the steadiness was real. I entered the 12-character primary authorization code from memory. The display asked for a secondary confirmation code. I entered that. Then it asked for a category designation, single code that would tell Earth Fleet Command receiving the signal 11.4 light minutes away through the hardline relay network what kind of event had occurred. There were 6 designations. 5 corresponded to defined incident categories: security breach, diplomatic failure, hostile contact, personnel loss, facility compromise. The 6th had No official name in any document I had ever been cleared to access. In the authorization manual, it appeared as a single lowercase word without explanation, without a usage note, without any supplementary guidance, except the instruction that it was never to be transmitted unless the sender was absolutely certain of what had witnessed and had considered the irreversibility of what they were about to do. The word was Amaranth. I stood at the terminal with my hand above the keypad for 3 full seconds. I want to be honest about those 3 seconds. I was not uncertain. I was being deliberate. I was making the choice with full awareness that it was a choice, not a reflexive response to shock. I wanted the decision to be a decision that a person had made, not an automated output of a system under stress. I thought about what I was doing. I thought about what it would produce. I thought about Ver of Omensa, standing at that table with 40 years of work in her briefcase and the specific, quiet courage it takes to walk toward the possibility of peace when you are not certain peace will meet you. Then I typed the word and pressed the transmit key. The confirmation indicator turned green. The signal entered the hardline network. It would reach the first relay in 11 seconds. From there it would travel at the network's maximum relay speed toward Earth Fleet Command with a timestamp and an origin code and a single lowercase word that had been waiting in a sealed authorization envelope for as long as I had been alive. I sat down on the floor of the ruined chamber with my back against the reinforced wall that had kept me breathing, and my 2 fractured ribs pressed fire against my left side with every breath, and I waited outside the station. The signal moved through the dark at the speed of light, and it carried with it everything that had just happened in that room, everything that had led to it, and everything that was now irreversibly in motion because of it. I was certain of what I had witnessed. That was the only requirement. That was enough. The medical pod on the rescue corvette smelled like antiseptic foam and recycled air and the faint metallic trace of the local anesthetic they had used when Owen Pash, the duty medic, set my fractured ribs. I had refused a full sedation. Owen had made the case for it with quiet professional confidence, explaining that the procedure was more comfortable with full sedation and that my recovery time would likely be shorter. I told him I understood that and still refused. He argued for 4 minutes, measured, not frustrated. The argument of someone who genuinely believed the medical recommendation he was making and then accepted the decision with a brief nod and completed the procedure with local blocking and a manual stabilization brace. He was good. He worked quickly and he explained each step before he did it, which I appreciated, and when he was finished, he gave me a nutrition supplement packet and told me to rest. Then I asked him to leave the room and he left, and the door sealed behind him, and I was alone in a medical pod the size of a large storage unit with 2 stabilized ribs and a sealed interface console on the shelf beside me that I had not yet touched. It was Owen's personal interface unit. He had left it on the shelf when he left, set face up, connected to the Corvette's internal network through the standard personal device link. I looked at it for a moment, then I picked it up. I was looking for a communication channel. I wanted to reach the fleet advisory channel that would be handling the incident report process, because I needed to begin providing my account before the sequence of events became difficult to Trace what I found instead when I accessed the network menu was an active Fleet Tactical feed on a channel designation that should not have been accessible through a personal device on an internal medical bay connection. It was open, completely open, unlocked live. Streaming. Someone had not closed the channel. Whether that was an error or a choice, I did not know and still do not know with certainty. I have been asked in 3 separate formal post-incident debriefs conducted over 18 months whether I accessed that channel by accident or by intention. I have told the truth each time. I found it by accident. I stayed in it by decision. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and the people conducting the debriefs recognize that, because none of them pressed the point past the first asking what I watched through that open channel for the next 11 hours changed my understanding of my own species in a way that nothing before it had. To explain what I watched, I need to explain something I had known in pieces but had never seen assembled into a whole. When the Kethan Hegman made first contact with humanity 43 years ago, the initial period of the relationship had a quality that those of us who study it now recognize as deceptive in its apparent normality. There was communication. There was an exchange of navigational data, which is typically among the first practical things that neighboring spacefaring species share, because collisions in transit lanes benefit no one. There was a period of several years in which both sides conducted the kind of cautious, observational engagement that precedes anything more substantive. Human analysts at the time described the Catherine as watchful and calculating, which in diplomatic language means that they were spending more time assessing what humanity was than communicating with it. The assessment had consequences. Within 5 years of first contact, it had become clear through accumulated incidents rather than through any single declaration that the Kethan hegemony operated on a framework of hierarchical species relationships. They did not extend formal recognition to species that could not immediately demonstrate military capacity comparable to their own. Territorial claims were respected only to the degree that they could be enforced. Their approach to expansion was consistent and long-term. They identified transitional zones, regions of space not yet fully claimed or defended by neighboring species, and they moved into them incrementally over years in ways designed not to trigger immediate response while still producing cumulative territorial change. The first 10 years of the human relationship included 6 documented border incidents, 2 seizures of unmanned human research platforms that were operating in legally ambiguous territory, and 1 direct transmission from a Hegman communications satellite delivered in the Catharan primary language with no translation provided, which intelligence analysis eventually rendered as a statement that the outer orbital zones of Earth's distant system should be considered areas of transitional hegemony interest. None of these actions had produced an armed response from humanity. There had been formal protests. There had been negotiated returns of the seized platforms. There had been diplomatic engagements at various levels of formality. There had been restraint, sustained and consistent, that the Kethan had observed, and as I would eventually come to understand, interpreted as structural inability rather than choice. They were not alone in that interpretation. Many of the galactic Observer Assembly's member species when the events of the Orvath incident eventually forced them to examine their assumptions, admitted that they had read humanity's consistent restraint as evidence of limited capacity that seemed to them the most parsimonious explanation. A species that chose restraint when it could choose force was either philosophically committed to restraint in a way that could be understood as a strategic constraint, or it lacked the capacity to be anything else. The Catherine had concluded the latter. Others had made the same assumption more quietly. They were wrong. The mistake they made was not about whether humanity had a military capacity. Everyone with functional intelligence gathering operations knew that humanity maintained defensive systems and that those systems had real capability. The mistake was about what restraint is when a species chooses it. Restraint is not the absence of capacity. Restraint is what you call it. When a species that has capacity decides on purpose not to use it, it is the decision itself that constitutes the restraint, not the absence of the capability. And the decision requires something to sustain it across decades and administrations and political cycles, and the accumulating weight of provocations that individually might seem manageable but which together form a pressure that lesser institutional architectures would eventually fail to hold. Humanity had built the architecture to hold it. The diplomatic architecture initiative was the public face of the response to the Chiron's 40 years of graduated pressure. It was funded openly, reported on regularly, and staffed by some of the finest analytical and communicative minds that Earth's universities produced. It operated on a governing premise that had survived multiple political transitions across every major Earth government. That conflict between species was most often the product of genuine misunderstanding, and that misunderstanding could be reduced over time through patient, skilled, culturally informed engagement. The initiative funded language programs that trained human diplomats to speak, read, and communicate in alien languages at native level fluency rather than relying on translation technology. It established cultural immersion institutes that allowed human diplomatic personnel to spend extended periods on alien administered stations and alien environments. It built institutions for the systematic analysis of alien decision-making frameworks, social hierarchy structures, and the kinds of things that each species interpreted as respect or as threat. Vera Osmantsa was one of the products of that architecture, one of its finest. She had gone through its full program and then spent 30 years putting what she had learned into practice in conditions that were rarely comfortable and never guaranteed to succeed. She had contributed to 4 successful interspecies agreements in that time, agreements that had reduced conflict, opened transit lanes, enabled scientific collaboration, and created the kind of ongoing communication infrastructure that makes future conflict incrementally less likely. She was what the diplomatic architecture initiative had been designed to produce. The other architecture had no public name. In the documents I eventually saw after the clearance review that my advisory appointment made possible, it was referred to internally as the continuity architecture. Externally, it had been funded through a rotating series of budget designations distributed across 31 different departmental line items in 12 different governmental institutions across 6 nations, none of which was individually large enough to attract serious scrutiny and which combined to form an annual expenditure that was once you understood what you were looking at. Quite remarkable, the continuity. Architecture had one purpose. If the diplomatic architecture was ever completely and irreversibly destroyed in a single moment, if the failure came not through gradual breakdown but through an act so direct and so final that the diplomatic process itself was what had been attacked, the continuity architecture would ensure that the attack did not go unanswered, not slowly, not through the standard pace of political deliberation and institutional mobilization immediately. In hours, the code word for its activation was Amaranth. I watched it begin to operate through Owen Pash's open tactical channel, and I watched it with the particular quality of attention that comes when you are seeing for the first time the full shape of something that you had only ever seen pieces of. The initial display I accessed showed a logistics consolidation summary. I am not a fleet tactical analyst, and some of what I saw required context I did not have to fully interpret, but I understood enough. The summary showed 412 vessels of multiple classifications, ranging from light patrol units to full combat platforms that had been positioned across a period of 3 years at strategic intervals along and near the boundary between human and Catharan territorial space. They had been positioned gradually in small groups across intervals long enough to avoid triggering pattern recognition algorithms in Kion sensor networks. They had not been positioned or designated as military assets in any communication that moved through channels the K Iran could monitor. They had been designated as freight relay platforms, navigational beacon services, emergency response staging units, and deep space maintenance facilities. Each one under that designation carried full combat capability and a locked command queue. The command queue in each vessel contained a set of sealed orders. Those orders had been placed years before. They were encrypted and could not be executed without a triggering key delivered through the relay network. The triggering key was derived from the Amaranth authorization code. When my transmission reached the first relay and began propagating through the network, the key was generated and broadcast simultaneously to all 412 vessels. The consolidation order began to execute before any human official had been formally notified of Ambassador Osmence's death, before the station's administrative alert had been filed, before any Senate chamber had convened, before any diplomatic channel had been opened. The system had been designed to precede all of those things because the people who designed it understood that the value of a deterrent that operates on the time scale of deliberation is limited when the triggering event is designed to eliminate the time for deliberation. On the tactical display, 400 green markers began to move. The movement was not chaotic, and it was not the urgent scatter of a crisis response. It was ordered, structured, convergent. The markers moved toward pre-calculated consolidation coordinates at a steady, deliberate pace, and watching them move, I felt something I had not expected to feel, a profound awareness of the patience that had produced this moment. 31 years, someone, or more accurately, a sustained succession of people across 3 decades of institutional continuity had maintained the knowledge that this response existed and had not used it, had not threatened with it, had not even hinted at it in any public communication or diplomatic exchange. The diplomatic architecture and the continuity architecture had run simultaneously in full mutual awareness, funded and maintained by the same institutional commitment to a single underlying belief that humanity would be exactly what it said it was: patient and genuine in its diplomacy, immediate and precise in its response if the diplomacy was destroyed by deliberate act. The tactical display updated in real time. I watched the 400 green markers move toward their consolidation coordinates, and I thought about the meetings that must have happened over 31 years, the arguments, the administrations that changed, and the political pressures that shifted, and the voices that must have said at various points that maintaining the continuity architecture was too expensive or too aggressive or inconsistent with the image of humanity that the diplomatic architecture was trying to project and the voices that answered. The architecture is not a contradiction of the diplomacy, it is the evidence that the diplomacy is genuine. A species that engages diplomatically because it has no other choice is performing patient. A species that engages diplomatically while maintaining the capacity to respond otherwise is practicing it. There is a difference, and the difference is what makes the engagement real. I thought about those voices. I do not know who they were. Most of them I know a few names from the documents I was eventually given access to. Mostly I know them by their work, which was 31 years of institutional persistence in the direction of an idea. A second feed appeared on the display alongside the tactical one. It was a communications intercept flagged in real time by Fleet Intelligence Systems and translated with the automated overlay that Fleet deployed for Kiran language intercepts. The transmission was originating from Hegman primary communication infrastructure and was addressed to all 17 member species of the Galactic Observer Assembly. The transmission described an attack. It said that a Catherine diplomatic delegation had been engaged without warning by a human security team at Orvath Station. It said the hegemony had acted in defense of its people. It said humanity had initiated hostilities and that the hegemony was responding with measured proportionality. It called on the Galactic Observer Assembly to condemn Earth's aggression and formally recognize the Catherine hegemony's right to protect its personnel and interests. It was a well-crafted transmission. It was internally consistent. It used language that the Galactic Observer Assembly's processes were designed to respond to the language of a victim seeking recognition, a narrative that positioned the hegemony as defending rather than initiating. If you had not been in the chamber, if you had not counted 11 seconds on the floor, if you had not pressed the key and heard the confirmation tone and sat down with your back against the one wall that it held, you might, receiving that transmission with no prior information, have found the basis for a position in it. I was less interested in the content of the transmission than in its timing. The Catherine had addressed the Galactic Observer Assembly before they addressed Earth directly, before any attempt at communication with the human government, before any acknowledgement of what had occurred. They had gone immediately to the audience they believed they needed, the 17 watching species, and they had delivered their version of events with The confidence of people who expected that version to fill the space before any alternative version could arrive. They had planned for humanity to be slow. They had built their entire strategy on the assumption that human institutional processes, the Senate debate, the diplomatic channels, the committee formations, the formal requests for information would produce delay long enough for the cover narrative to take hold in the assemblies. Deliberations, the transmission took 4 minutes and 17 seconds to transmit. Full. When it ended, the Amaranth fleet had been moving for 22 minutes and 11 seconds. I set the interface on the shelf beside me and closed my eyes for a moment. 2 fractured ribs, a nutrition supplement I had not finished, and the open tactical feed of 400 vessels moving. In the dark, I thought about Vera, about the specific sentence she had been saying when the charge detonated: mutual withdrawal distance, the careful language of a framework designed to give 2 species something concrete to hold on to, something measurable, something that turned the abstract work of trust building into a physical parameter that automated systems could observe and respond to. It was small, as the components of real diplomatic work are almost always small, and it had been real. Everything she built was real. On the screen, the green markers converge toward their coordinates, and the tactical overlay showed a projected time to full consolidation, and the number was smaller than anything the hegemony's strategic planners had likely considered possible. Owen Pash came back to the room 40 minutes after I had asked him to leave. He stopped in the doorway. When he saw the interface in my lap, he looked at me. I looked at him. The open channel was still displaying on the screen. He said quietly and without expression, "The channel got left open." And I said yes. He nodded once. He did not ask for the interface back. He went to the supply cabinet on the far wall, opened it, removed 2 nutrition supplement packets, and placed one beside me on the shelf. Then he sat down on the floor near the door with his back against the wall and his view angled away from the screen, and he opened his own packet and began eating in silence. We stayed like that for a long time, the 2 of us in a sealed room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, while 400 green markers in the dark moved toward the place where the marker for V. Thoron's decision was located. On the feed, a second window opened. Communications log from Earth Fleet. Commands outgoing channel, timestamp 9 minutes after the fleet reached its consolidated position. A transmission to the Kieran Hegman's primary diplomatic relay. The transmission was 4 words. It said, "We received your statement." Then it closed. I had been in diplomatic security for 14 months. In that time, I had watched enough negotiations to develop a working understanding of what language does in high-stakes exchanges, what it signals and what it withholds, and what its weight is as a tool for words, not a threat, not a demand, not a proposal, just an acknowledgement, cold and complete, of the hegemony's cover story. It said, "We heard it. We are not responding to it. We are responding to what happened." The Kieran did not reply. I lay back on the medical pod surface and looked at the ceiling and listened to my own breathing, careful and measured because the stabilized ribs required it, and outside the hull of the Corvette the stars held their positions in the dark, and the green markers kept moving, and somewhere 11.44 light minutices away, the world that Vera Osman Mensa had spent her career trying to make slightly less dangerous was in the process of learning something that she had always known and that had just cost everything she had, that patience is a choice and choices have costs, and costs when they are paid in full by someone who chose something real do not disappear. They become the weight of what comes next. The green markers moved. I finished the nutrition supplement I kept watching. Hour 1 began with a silence inside the Catherine Hegman's military infrastructure that the Intercept analysts later described as the silence of a system that has just measured something and does not yet know how to report what it has found. I know what that hour looked like inside Hegemony Fleet Command because of the Intercept summary I was given access to. 4 months after the incident, the summary had been compiled by Earth Fleet Intelligence Division from sensor data, communications intercepts, and translated internal traffic collected across the 17 hours of the engagement. It was marked at the highest classification level available to my advisory clearance, which meant I was one of fewer than 300 people who saw it in full. I have read it many times. I have read it with the same attentiveness that I used to bring to threat assessments and presummate security reviews because it contains something I believe is worth understanding what it looks like from the inside when a species realizes in real time that the world it had been modeling for 40 years was not the world that existed. The first intercept logged from Hegemony Fleet Command came at 53 minutes after the Amaranth Fleet reached its consolidated position. It was addressed to Viron on the Hegemony's primary secure relay, and it asked a single question. It asked whether the humans had been given any prior indication that the summit would not proceed as planned. Vithron's reply arrived 20 minutes later from the diplomatic transport carrying him back toward Hegemony Inner Systems. The reply was a single sentence. It said warnings were not a component of the operation as designed. I have returned to that sentence more times than I can count. Warnings were not a component of the operation as designed. It is a sentence that tells you precisely and without ambiguity what Veron believed about humanity at the time he authorized the summit chamber operation. He believed that the absence of a warning did not matter, that humanity receiving no warning would require enough time to deliberate and mobilize and coordinate, that the window for effective response would close. Naturally, he believed that human institutional processes, whatever they eventually produced, would be slow enough to matter. This was not an irrational belief based on the available evidence. It was a reasonable extrapolation from 40 years of observed human behavior. In every significant incident involving the Catherine Hegemony over 4 decades, humanity had responded with processes, with committees and investigations and formal protests and carefully worded communes. The response time to any given provocation had been measured in weeks and months. The Catherine intelligence apparatus had built its predictive models on that history, and those models were based on the historical data available to them, well supported. Historical data had been incomplete. What was missing from it was the second program, the continuity architecture, and specifically the 31 years of preparation that had produced a fleet already in position, already carrying sealed orders, already waiting for a trigger that required no deliberation, no mobilization, no institutional process. The trigger had been designed to bypass all of that. The trigger had been designed by people who understood with complete clarity that the value of a response that depends on deliberation time is nullified when the triggering event is specifically designed to consume that time before response can form. In our one hegemony fleet, command placed its inner system defense infrastructure on elevated readiness. This was the correct response to the situation as they understood it. What they did not understand yet was the scale and disposition of what was moving toward them, because their long-range sensor networks had not resolved a complete picture. The initial readings showed a large human formation at the Hegman border. The composition, the specific vessel classifications, and the formation geometry required more time to interpret. When the interpretation came, it did not match any scenario in their predictive models. The fleet was not moving in an attack formation. It was moving in a structured column at a steady, deliberate speed that suggested purpose rather than urgency. It was not broadcasting any offensive communications. It was also not responding to the hegemony standard sensor challenge protocol, a set of query signals that military platforms in the region were expected to acknowledge and respond to. Every species operating in this region knew the protocol. Responding to it was basic navigational etiquette, the equivalent of identifying yourself when entering a monitored space. The Amaranth fleet did not respond. It did not acknowledge the challenges. It continued a course and speed. By hour 2, the analytical staff at Hegemony Fleet Command had begun expressing in their internal communications a specific kind of concern that is different from tactical concern. Tactical concern is about what an enemy is going to do. What they were expressing was something closer to interpretive uncertainty. They did not know how to classify what they were observing. The behavior of the human fleet did not fit the patterns their analytical frameworks were built to process. It was not aggressive in the defined sense. It was not communicative in any form. It was not making demands or issuing warnings or positioning for a specific target approach. It was simply moving at a consistent pace in a direction with a completeness and a quiet that their systems could not assign a meaning to. In hour 3, the outer system governors began transmitting to Fleet Command 3. Governors of Hegemony territorial stations in the outer system sent urgent requests for instructions when the human column entered visual range of their installations. They asked what they should do. Fleet Command told them to maintain position and avoid initiating contact. The column passed each station in succession at the same steady pace, without reducing speed, without acknowledging the stations, without any signal, no warning shot, no broadcast, no communication of any kind. I have been asked whether the decision to maintain communication silence during the approach was intended as a psychological tactic designed to unsettle the hegemony before the engagement. I cannot answer that from personal knowledge because I was not in the planning sessions where that decision was made. What I can say is that watching the feed in real time, watching the column move through space, without speaking, I did not experience it as theater. I experienced it as the movement of something that had already said everything it needed to say. The Amaranth fleet was not building toward a Statement, it was the statement of what happens when 40 years of documented patience runs out of runway. Our four brought the Hegmans. First formal diplomatic communication. It was not addressed to Earth Fleet Command, it was addressed to the United Nations Secretary General, transmitted through the standard diplomatic relay infrastructure. This told me immediately that whoever drafted it still believed they were operating in the space of the political process, that the relevant field of action was the conversation between governments rather than the movement of ships. The message offered three things. First, a formal expression of regret for the events that had occurred at Orvith Station, using language that carefully avoided specifying who had done what or to whom. Second, a proposal for an independent multi-species tribunal to investigate the incident and make determinations about responsibility. Third, an offer of financial reparations to the families of the deceased. Taken together, it was a document that would have been a reasonable basis for a conversation in a different context at a different moment, after a different kind of event. It was the kind of document that a skilled diplomatic team produces when they believe the situation is still in the phase where documents can determine outcomes. Earth Fleet Command's acknowledgement came back in 11 minutes. One sentence. It said that the message had been received, nothing about the substance, nothing about the tribunal offer or the reparations proposal or the expression of regret. Acknowledgement confirmed receipt of the transmission and provided no further information. The column continued at course and speed. I read in the Intercept summary the internal communication at Hegemony Fleet Command in the 40 minutes after that acknowledgement arrived. The duty officer on the night watch, a mid-ranking tactical coordinator, who the summary rendered as Kev, filed a log entry at the end of his shift that was not addressed to his commanding officer or to any formal recipient. It was a personal notation. His shift record, the kind of record-keeping that exists in the operational logs of every military institution I have ever worked near, where people in the middle of events write things down that they need to put somewhere outside their own heads. Notation said they are not negotiating. They did not come to negotiate. 5 words. Kev had understood in that moment what his superiors had not yet accepted, which was that the framework they had been operating inside since the summit, the framework in which a sufficiently substantial diplomatic offer would slow or redirect the human response, did not apply. The fleet was not a negotiating tool. It had not come to negotiate a withdrawal in exchange for concessions. The diplomatic channel that the hegemony had opened with the Secretary General was not being used. Kev could see the gap between the diplomatic activity being generated at the hegemony center and the unchanged behavior of the fleet at its perimeter, and the gap told him what the diplomatic activity could not. Hour 5 and 6 brought a series of responses from hegemony inner system, governments, and regional administrators, all transmitted to Fleet Command, all requesting information about what was happening and what the defense plan was. Fleet Command sponsors were brief and contained no substantive information, which told me that Fleet Command did not have a good answer to give them. The plan that had been built for a human response assumed a slower, more deliberate response, one that would give the hegemony's defensive systems time to Form, the plan had assumed things that were no longer true. In hour 7, the hegemon transmitted a second communication to Earth. This one was addressed directly to Fleet Command, rather than to the political government, which indicated that someone in the hegemon's chain of command had shifted their assessment of who the relevant counterparty was. The communication asked for a statement of intent. It asked what the fleet's objective was. Fleet Command's response came back in 18 minutes. It was 6 words. It said, "The fleet's objective is its destination." I read that 6-word response 3 times. It is, in its way, a more complete statement than a lengthy declaration of intent would have been. It said, "We are not going to tell you what we are going to do. We are going to do it. Objective is the destination," and clears throat. "The destination will be reached and you will observe the objective when the destination is reached." The hegemony went quiet for 90 minutes after that response. I do not know what was happening in those 90 minutes inside their government. The intercept summary covers Fleet Command's communications, but not the internal political processes. I can make inferences based on what came before and after that silence, but I prefer to stay with what the record shows. Hour 9 is the one that stays with me above all others in the summary. There is an intercept from that hour that I have returned to more times than I can account for. It is a short exchange logged on a low-priority personal messaging system on one of the hegemony's inner system patrol platforms. Personal messaging systems on military platforms are not typically included in intelligence intercepts because they are considered low value in. The volume is large. This exchange was flagged by an automated keyword system and pulled for human review, and the analyst who reviewed it made the judgment to include it in the compiled summary, and I am glad that analyst made that judgment because it is the most human document in the entire file, despite having been written by members of a species that is not human. Their names in the summary's transliteration system rendered as Wrath and Sova. They were both assigned to the patrol platform. The record showed they had been on shift for 6 hours when the exchange occurred. Wrath sent the first message. It was sent through the personal channel rather than any operational system. It was a simple question, casual in its phrasing, the kind of question you ask someone when you are sitting in a quiet room watching something you do not understand move toward you on a sensor display. Wrath asks SOA what humans do when they are angry, not what fleet tactical doctrine predicted, not what the intelligence models projected, what humans do. The question of someone trying to understand something that the models had not prepared them for. SOA took 11 minutes to respond. 11 minutes is a long time for a personal message exchange. I think about what those 11 minutes contained. I think about SOA on a patrol platform in the middle of the 9th hour of a developing crisis, reading Wrath's question and trying to find an honest answer for it. The response in the summary's translation read, "I do not know. I thought we were the only ones who had ever made them angry." I put the summary down the first time I read that sentence. I needed a moment with it, so was not wrong in any literal sense. Kethan Hegman had generated more friction with humanity over 40 years than any other species. They had been the most sustained source of provocation, the most consistent Challenger, the most deliberate tester of human patience. In a narrow factual reading, SOA's claim that her people were the only ones who had ever seriously tested human anger was approximately correct. What makes the sentence worth holding is not the first half, it is the second half, the admission that she did not know, after 40 years, after 4 decades of contact, intelligence gathering, cultural analysis, diplomatic interaction, and strategic planning built around predictions of human behavior, after all of that investment in understanding. Military officer on a patrol platform, watching the product of 31 years of human preparation move through her operational zone, had to admit to her colleague that she did not know what the answer to the most basic question was. They had watched the wrong thing for 40 years. They had watched the diplomats. They had watched the statements. They had watched the restraint, and they had concluded that the restraint was the totality of what they were looking at. They had not understood that the restraint was a decision maintained by people who valued it and who had also, with full awareness, built something behind it so that the restraint would remain a choice rather than a necessity. V. Thorin had watched 40 years of humanity being patient and concluded that the patience was structural. It was not structural. It was chosen every day by every person who funded both programs and maintained both programs and believed that both programs expressed the same thing, which was we are exactly what we say we are. In hour 12, the Amaranth Fleet reached its operational coordinates. What followed lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes. I will describe it with the same precision I have applied to everything else in this account. The fleet did not fire on population centers, not any of them, not on any world or station or platform within the hegemony's territory where civilian populations resided. It did not strike communication relays that serve civilian functions. It did not target agricultural platforms, water processing infrastructure, medical facilities, transit hubs, educational institutions, or any installation whose primary purpose was sustaining the lives and activities of ordinary people. The targeting package that had been developed as part of the continuity architecture's operational planning was, as the post-engagement analysis confirmed, the product of years of careful analysis and ethical deliberation. The criteria were specific, and they had been developed with full awareness of the distinction between the hegemony as a government and the hegemony as a population of living beings who had not authorized the Orvith operation. Every Catherine military orbital station above a certain classification within the operational zone was disabled. Every hegemony warship above a defined tonnage threshold was rendered non-operational. The method used was targeted system disruption rather than physical destruction, wherever the operational parameters allowed it, which reduced the number of Chthon lives lost significantly compared to what full kinetic engagement would have produced. The specific planning facility from which the Orvith station operation had been authorized was struck directly and with precision. Intelligence identifying that facility had been collected over years through methods that the summary did not describe in detail, but that the targeting accuracy confirmed were reliable. The engagement ended. The fleet held position. It did not advance. It did not expand the engagement parameters. It held information at its Operational coordinates, broadcasting. Nothing responding to nothing, doing. Nothing except being present and being. Undeniable. In hour 17 I received a ping on the interface. It came from a fleet command channel I had not opened. I was tired in a way that had moved past physical and into something that does not have a clean name, the tiredness of someone who has been watching an enormous thing happen and has been alone. With the watching, I opened the ping. It was from Fleet Admiral Chimaka Adami, the operational commander of the Amaranth Response. I had never met her. I knew her name and her career outline. From briefings, the message was not long. It said that there was this an address to the Galactic Observer, assembly being arranged, that it needed to come from someone who had been in the summit chamber, that Ambassador Osman Mensa had died carrying something worth naming out loud in front of the galaxy. And the Admiral thought the person who had been closest to her, the person who had made the decision at the terminal, was the right person to name it. She asked if I was willing. I sat with the message for a long time. Outside the hull, the stars were where they always are. The green markers on the feed held their positions. The engagement was over. The next thing was not the fleets. I typed one word and sent it. Yes. Then I asked Owen Pash, who appeared in the doorway with the quiet timing of a medic who has been doing this for a long time, to prepare the transport documentation for the Galactic Observer Assembly platform. There was work to do, work that had always been the more important work that Vera Ozensa had spent her entire life doing. It was her turn to be carried. The Galactic Observer Assembly's emergency session convened on the concourse and orbital platform, administered by the Arathi and positioned at the navigational center of its 17-member species combined territorial footprint. The Arathi had built it generations ago, and it showed their architectural preferences clearly. Wide corridors with ceiling heights, calibrated to their considerable vertical scale, materials that aged gracefully rather than being replaced on cycles, and a quality of ambient light in the amber register that their visual system found restful. For human eyes, it produced an effect like the interior of a room at the end of a long afternoon. And I found this either very calming or very melancholy, depending on where I was in my own head. I was shown to a preparation room adjacent to the main chamber and given 3 hours before I was expected to speak. A communication staff officer from the Earth Senate Liaison Office was also there when I arrived. A man named Colby Yates, who told me that he had been sent to manage the broadcast feed and to ensure the statement aligned with approved communication parameters. He said this with the calm of a professional doing his job, and I acknowledged it without commenting on the implications of the phrase approved communication parameters. And we spent the first 30 minutes in the room conducting a polite mutual assessment of each other's intentions. Then I left the preparation room and walked the corridor outside the chamber for the next 2 hours. I walked it end to end 4 times at the pace I use when I am thinking rather than moving. Corridor was 140 m long, and its floor was a material that absorbed sound. So, my footsteps produced almost nothing, and the only sound as I walked was the soft, continuous circulation of the concourse's air systems and the occasional passage of assembly staff. Moving between sections, I did not prepare notes, I did not rehearse Language, I thought about Vera's Mensa. I thought about specific things, not general ones, because specific things are the truth and general things are the summary of truth, and what I was about to do required truth more than it required summary. I thought about the conversation we had 2 nights before, the summit with the untouched tea and the view of Earth below the window. I thought about the way she said that showing up mattered more than certainty. I thought about the 4 months she had spent building the ceasefire framework, the consultations she had run, the analysis she had commissioned, the drafts she had reviewed and revised, until the language gave both sides something they could hold without losing, something they could not afford to give up. I thought about the fact that she had been mid-sentence presenting the section on mutual withdrawal distance when the charge activated, that she had died in the middle of her work, that the work had been real. I also thought about something she had told me in an earlier month of our working together during a security briefing that had extended into a longer conversation. She had said that the hardest part of diplomatic work was not the opposition you faced. It was the internal argument, the part of you that asked whether what you were doing would actually make things better, or whether you were just occupying the space where better things should be. She said that the only answer she had ever found to that question was specificity. You had to name exactly what you were trying to build, not in abstract terms, but in the concrete language of what would exist if it worked. That abstraction was where doubt lived, and specificity was how you moved through doubt without being stopped by it. I thought about that as I walked, about specificity, about what would exist if the work worked. The chamber was full when I entered. The Galactic Observer Assembly's 17-member delegations were seated in their assigned positions around the central platform, which was circular, raised by 1/3 of a meter, and equipped with translation technology in its floor surface. Behind the delegations, the technical and communication staff occupied the outer rows. The chamber capacity was 240. It was close to that number. Kobe Yates was at the broadcast station near the sidewall. He had I noticed as I passed a communications override panel visible on his control surface. I noted its location. I walked to the center of the platform. I looked at the room, then I spoke. I did not offer a greeting or a procedural opening. Procedural openings are gestures of courtesy, and courtesy serves a purpose. But the purpose it serves is establishing mutual willingness to engage. I did not need to establish mutual willingness. The willingness was not in question. What was in question was whether what was said in this room would be honest, and procedural courtesy does not contribute to that. I said she came in peace. She died in peace. We did not. 9 words. I watched them land in the room. The quality of silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of attention that has been fully engaged, the kind of silence that a room full of beings produces when they have stopped everything else and are only listening. Then I talked about Vera Mensa, not her formal biography. I did not list her postings or recite her credentials. I talked about the specific texture of who she was, the particular quality of her attention, the way she refused to treat any living being across any cultural or physiological or historical distance as beyond the possibility of being understood. I talked about the untouched tea and the statement that showing up was a fundamental requirement of the work. Regardless of uncertainty, I talked about the 4 months of building and the specific language and the section on mutual withdrawal distance that she had been presenting when the charge activated. I talked about what she had been doing in that room, not as a symbol, as a person who had spent 40 years building a very specific kind of expertise, brought it to a table that she was not certain was safe, and used it in service of a framework that was genuinely fair to both parties and genuinely worth having. Then I explained the patient's doctrine, both of it, all of it. I had not been authorized to do this. Kobe Yates would know within 30 seconds that I was departing from approved communication parameters. I knew this before I began speaking, and I judged with the same quality of certainty that I had brought to the terminal on Orvith Station that the alternative was worse. The alternative was a statement that was diplomatically complete and factually incomplete, and factually incomplete in a way that would leave the 17 watching species with a misleading understanding of what had just happened and why. Misleading understandings in diplomatic contexts produce the exact kind of misinterpretations that had produced Orvith Station in the first place. The cure for a misunderstanding is not a more carefully managed version of the same misunderstanding. The cure is accuracy. I explained the diplomatic architecture initiative. I named what it had built, the languages learned, the institutions founded, the professional core trained, the 4 successful interspecies agreements it had produced. I explained that this program had not failed, that it was working, that Vera Omensa was one of its finest products, and that her death was not evidence of the program's inadequacy. It was evidence of what happened when one party to a diplomatic engagement decided that the engagement was not in their interest. Then I explained the continuity architecture, functionally not in operational detail. I said that humanity had spent the same 40 years in full awareness of the diplomatic architecture and fully committed to it, building a second program designed to ensure that if the diplomatic architecture was ever completely and irreversibly destroyed by deliberate act, the destruction would not be answered with silence, that the second program was not a fallback for when diplomacy failed. It was the evidence that the diplomacy was genuine, that when humanity chose engagement over response, it was a choice made by a species that had another option, and a choice made by someone who has another option is more honest than a choice made by someone who does not. The room was still. I continued. I said, we are not a patient species because we have no alternative. We are a patient species because we decided to be. The Kethan Hegman read 40 years of our most careful and most sustained behavior and concluded that the behavior was the limit of our capacity. It was not the limit, it was the expression of our values. We told every species through everything we did in 40 years what we valued. The Ketharan assumed our values were a constraint. We spent 31 years making certain they were a choice. The Eri ambassador, whose name I will render as Ambassador Sorrel Ethan, raised one long-fingered hand in the gesture I had been told indicated request to speak. I acknowledged the gesture. Ambassador Sorrel Ethan asked whether humanity considered the scale of its military response to be ethically proportionate. I did not have a prepared answer. I gave the true one. I said I am a security officer. I was present when a person I had sworn to protect was killed while delivering a genuine ceasefire proposal to people who had privately asked for it. I can tell you, from specific knowledge of the engagement parameters, that the response did not target civilian populations, civilian infrastructure, or any installation whose primary function was sustaining the lives of ordinary Kethan people. The engagement targeted military infrastructure and the planning facility where the Orveth operation was authorized. Whether that meets the philosophical criteria for proportionality is a question I leave to people whose expertise is philosophy. What I can tell you is what we did and what we did not do. We did not do the thing they did to us. We did not walk into a room carrying a peace proposal and detonate a charge under a table. Ambassador lowered the hand from the mere collective delegation. An attention signal was raised. I acknowledged it. The Mr. Delegate asked whether humanity intended to maintain the continuity architecture as a permanent program. I considered the question for a moment. Then I said yes, both programs will continue. The diplomatic architecture will be funded at its highest level. History, because if there are species in this room who have never considered what they might gain by testing what humanity is capable of, that is because of what people like Ambassador Osmondson did for 40 years, and that work deserves more support, not less, and the continuity architecture will remain in place, because being what you say you are requires that your words and your capacity align. We are telling you this openly in this chamber in front of everyone watching this feed. We do not hide what we value or what we have built. In service of those values, I paused. The room remained quiet. Then I said I would like to read something into the permanent record of this assembly. I removed from the inner pocket of my jacket a folded document printed on physical paper because I had asked for it that way. I wanted to hold it in my hands. I read the title, the date of completion, the name of the author. Then I read every section heading and every substantive provision of Vera Omens's ceasefire framework without shortening any clause at the pace she would have used when presenting it, and I did not stop until I had read every word. It took 17 minutes and 4 seconds. The room held its silence for all of it. When I finished, I placed the document on the platform surface in front of me. Then I looked up and I said her name, her rank, her home world, her date of birth, and her date of death, and the designation of the mission she had been on, into the permanent record of the Galactic Observer Assembly, into the record that 17 species and their combined populations would have access to for as long as the record was maintained. Behind me, I was aware of Colby Yates making contact with his control panel. I turned and looked at him directly. He met my eyes. He had the look of a person who has been given instructions that he is no longer sure apply the situation in front of him. He lowered his hand from the override panel and looked back at his screen. I turned back to the chamber. The 17 delegations were exactly where they had been when I began. Not one had closed a relay, not one had indicated a desire to conclude the session. Every attending species with their combined populations watching through their relay feeds was still present. I remained on the platform until the assembly chair formally called the session closed. Then I walked out into the amberlit corridor and sat on a bench along the wall and put my face, my hands, and stayed that way for some time. The work that Vera had spent 40 years doing was now in the galactic record. It was permanent, whatever came after that was permanent. I thought about whether that was enough. I decided it was not the right question. The right question was whether it was real. It was real. It had always been real. That was the thing about Vera Omens's work. It was not real because it had succeeded in every instance. It was real because she had done it honestly, with full understanding of what it cost and what it was worth, and why those were not the same calculation. It was real. That was what I needed to be able to say. The months after Orth moved into different registers at once, and living inside both of them at the same time, required a kind of divided attention that I had not previously been asked to sustain for long periods. In one register, things happened quickly. In the other, they moved at the pace that large damaged structures move when they begin to recalibrate, slowly, with effort, in increments that would be invisible from the outside if you were not watching carefully. The quick things. First, within 72 hours of the Amaranth fleet withdrawal to a holding position beyond the hegemony's outer boundary, I began receiving communications from the Catherine Hegman's outer system governors, not from the central government, from the governors of the 3 outer system territorial stations that the Amaranth column had passed through during its approach. The administrators of the places that had watched the fleet go by and had asked Fleet Command for instructions, and had received the instruction to maintain position and avoid contact. They were communicating with Earth's diplomatic offices directly, using informal channels that suggested they were doing so without full authorization from the hegemon central government in its current form. The communications were careful. They were formal in their language, but careful in their content, in the way that communications are careful when the person sending them is aware that the political situation around them is fluid and they are not certain which direction it is going to settle. They asked about the status of the diplomatic recovery process. They asked whether Earth had stated any conditions for further engagement. They expressed in the measured language of outer system administrators who had been watching the consequences of decisions made at the center that the communities they governed had interests that the events of the past weeks had complicated significantly. I read those communications with attention. Outer system governors who communicate informally with a counterparty during an active political crisis are officials who have concluded that the formal channels are not adequate to the moment, and that conclusion is itself information. They were telling me that the political structure inside the hegemony was not monolithic, that Vethorin's faction had not represented a consensus position, that there were constituencies within the hegemony for whom the outcome of the Orvith operation had been a genuine shock, rather than a strategic calculation gone wrong. I passed that assessment along through the advisory process with a recommendation that the diplomatic recovery framework treat those constituencies as distinct from the central government's previous position. The recommendation was accepted. The central government took longer. I had expected this. The internal reckoning that was happening in the hegemony's political center during this period was not visible to me in real time, and only became partially legible through the intelligence summaries that reached my desk over the following months. What I could reconstruct from those summaries was the broad outline of a process that every large political institution undergoes when a major decision by faction within it produces consequences that the broader institution cannot absorb without change. There were hearings, there were resignations, there were formal accountability processes that the hegemony's internal constitutional mechanisms required. VTH Thurin himself was removed from all positions of authority within 11 days of the engagement's conclusion and placed in a formal accountability process that the hegemony's legal structure would take months to complete. The new diplomatic office that emerged from that process was staffed differently than the previous one, whether the difference in staffing reflected a genuine difference in orientation or was a presentation designed for external consumption was a question I held with appropriate skepticism throughout the early communications. The answer over time revealed itself in the substance of what the new office was willing to discuss and the pace at which it moved toward genuine commitments. The 4-month negotiation that produced the final treaty framework was not conducted by me. I was in the room for many of the sessions in my advisory capacity, and I contributed to the analytical preparation and the drafting review, but the lead negotiators were experienced professionals from Earth's diplomatic corps, and I was glad of that. The work required skills and a quality of sustained attention that Vera Omensa could have brought to it, and that I could not yet, and probably not in the same way she would have, because I was not her and the role was not mine. What I could bring was presence, and I brought it to every session I attended. In the second month, before the formal negotiation had fully begun, I received a notification from the Catharin hegemony's new diplomatic office. The notification said that the hegemony wished to express through the formal treaty framework, when it was completed, a specific commitment. It said that the hegemony was requesting, as part of the treaty structure, that the agreement be formally named. The name they requested was the Osmondsa framework. I read that notification 3 times. I did what I always do when I receive something that I want to be sure I am understanding correctly. I put it down and came back to it after an interval and read it again. The 3rd time I read it, I looked for the calculation. I looked for the strategic advantage that might be gained by a party to a negotiation that chose to name the resulting agreement after the person it had killed. I examined the request from every angle that my training and experience had given me access to. I found no calculation. What I found under the examination was the strong and somewhat unsettling possibility that the request was genuine, that someone inside the new Kiran diplomatic office had decided that the most honest thing they could do, the most real acknowledgement of what had happened and what it had cost, was to attach that name permanently to the framework that would govern the relationship going forward, that the name would be a reminder every time the framework was referenced of the specific cost of what the previous faction had chosen to do. I thought about what Vera would have said about that. I sat with it for a while. Then I decided that what she would have said was probably not mine to guess, and that the decision in front of me was straightforward. I approved the request on behalf of the Earth Advisory Office without waiting for Senate clearance. The Senate ratified the decision in the subsequent review session. No one raised an objection. The treaty became the O.C. Mensa framework. It was signed in a formal ceremony on the concourse with Ambassador Sorlethan serving as the Assembly's guarantor. I attended as the sole remaining member of the Orvith Summit delegation. I wore the same uniform I had worn at the Orvith station. Summit, repaired and cleaned with the same security corps insignia because I wanted to be wearing what I had been wearing when it mattered. And I wanted there to be a threat of continuity between that moment and this one. In the third month, the Intelligence Division sent me an analytical summary under a separate classification cover from the standard briefings. It was brief. It said that 2 species whose names were not included in the version I received had been running operations in the period before the Orvith incident, that the analysis characterized as preparations for phometric actions against Earth diplomatic personnel in contested transit zones. It said that both operations had been stood down within 48 hours of the concourse broadcast. Neither had been officially acknowledged, neither had been referenced in any communication to Earth. The evidence for the stand-down was indirect, drawn from pattern analysis of movement orders that had been issued and countermanded, and personnel reassignments that followed the pattern of a covert program being quietly closed. I sat with that information for a long time. 2 operations, 2 sets of people somewhere out in the space between species who had been approaching the same decision that V. Thorin had made, and who had pulled back without anyone asking them to, and without telling anyone they had done it. The absence of communication was the interesting part. They had not needed to explain themselves. The calculation had been obvious enough that they had done the arithmetic privately and arrived at the answer privately and made the adjustment privately. They had learned what SOA had not known how to articulate in that 9th hour, what humans do when they are angry. And having learned it, they had chosen something different from what they had been planning to choose. I do not feel triumph about this. I want to be honest about that. I understand that some people reading this account will feel triumph about it, and I understand why. The outcome was better than the alternative. People who would have been killed were not killed. That is real, and it matters. What I feel when I think about those 2 stand-ons is something more complicated. I feel the weight of the demonstration that produced them. The demonstration was real, and it was necessary, and it was as careful and as restrained as the people who built it could make it. And it still cost what it cost. It cost Vera Omensa. It cost every person in that summit chamber. It cost the version of the future where the ceasefire framework gets presented to a table where everyone is still alive and listening. I carry both things, the outcome and the cost. I do not think you get to have the outcome without carrying the cost, and I do not think carrying the cost means the outcome does not matter. It just means that you hold both. In the 4th month, the Galactic Observer Assembly sent a formal request to Earth. It was addressed jointly to the Senate, to Fleet Admiral Adme, and to me by name in my advisory capacity. It requested a copy of the patient's doctrine, not a summary, not a selected excerpt, the full architectural document, including the planning frameworks, the operational development history, and the authorization protocols. It requested the unredacted version. This request generated a Significant internal debate. I attended 2 of the discussion sessions, and I read the minutes of the others. The arguments against releasing the document were serious ones. The continuity architecture represented decades of strategic planning. Its specifics were sensitive intelligence, making the full document available to 17 other species, would reduce its operational effectiveness in any future application. There were species among the 17 whose alignment with human interests was not fully established and whose responses to the document's contents were not predictable. Fleet Admiral Adami attended the final discussion session. She listened to all of the arguments in their full form without interrupting. Then she said something I have kept in my personal log since I heard it. She said humanity built that document to be honest. Keeping it secret now would make it a threat. Sharing it makes it what we intended it to be. The document was sent in full, unredacted, with a single accompanying note written by the Admiral in direct language rather than diplomatic form, addressed to the Assembly's member delegations. Collectively, the note said, "We hope you never need it. We hope you understand. We always will." I was not present when the 17 delegations received the document. I received a summary of the immediate reactions through the liaison office. Most delegations acknowledged receipt and provided no immediate substantive response, which is the standard diplomatic response to receiving something significant and needing time to assess it. The Urathi delegation, through Ambassador Sorrel Ethan, requested a personal communication channel with the Earth Diplomatic Office and spent 4 hours asking questions. The questions were not strategic, they were institutional. How had the decision to run both programs simultaneously reached and sustained? How had the institutional knowledge been maintained across decades and multiple political transitions? What mechanisms had prevented one program from undermining the other? What kind of organizational culture produced the quality of commitment that 31 years of continuous preparation required? They had been building civilizational infrastructure for longer than humanity had been a species with a written language. They were asking us how we had sustained the patience. I did not attend those sessions, but I read the transcripts, and reading them, I thought about what it meant that the oldest space-faring civilization in the assemblies membership had found that question worth 4 hours. I went back to Orvith Station. In the 5th month, the visit was framed as part of the formal post-incident review process, and it had been on my request list since shortly after the formal debriefs concluded. The station had been partially repaired, the damage to the summit wing had been contained, and the structure was sound, but the summit chamber itself and the immediate surrounding spaces had been left in their post-incident state by agreement of the station's administrative council, pending a decision about the long-term status of that section. I walked through the station's main public corridor, past the areas I had been briefed in 14 months ago when Vera and I arrived for the pre-summit security walkthrough, and into the summit wing through the access point the rescue team had used. The corridor was clean, the lighting was functioning, the air was the same recycled mix as everywhere else on the station. I walked to the sealed door of the chamber and stood in front of it for a moment, and then I turned and went instead to the rear service corridor. The reinforced wall strut was where it had always been. The repair work around. It had been completed, but the strut itself had not been removed or adjusted. The work crew had built around it, leaving a visible asymmetry in the wall section that no structural engineer would have chosen if the design had been approached from scratch. Someone had made the decision to leave it exactly as it was, and other people had made the decision to respect that choice. In the execution of the repair work, there was a note card on the strut attached with a thin wire through one of the existing support bolt holes, handwritten in 3 languages: Standard English Formal Script and the Orbit Station Lingua Franca that the 3 administering species had developed together. It said, "This is where one of our people survived. We leave it as we found it. No signature." The handwriting was small and very careful. I did not touch the note. I looked at it for a long time, and then I looked at the strut and I thought about 9 cm of unreported structural reinforcement and the gap between what a document says and what a wall contains, and about the way the gap had been entirely without intention, exactly the gap that mattered. The station master, Corin Marsh, was the administrative head of Orvath Station and had been for 11 years. He was a contained, quiet man whose manner carried the particular quality of someone who has made peace with his professional responsibilities, including the parts of them he cannot control. He met me in the administrative wing and offered tea, which I accepted, and we sat at a small table in his office with the view through the wide window showing the station's exterior infrastructure against the dark. He told me the note had appeared on the strut 3 weeks after the incident, during the early part of the station's partial lockdown period before full public access had been restored. He said the administrative team had reviewed the access logs from that period and found no anomalies that identified a specific individual. He had decided not to investigate further. He said he had been on duty in the administrative wing when the summit alert came through. He said the longest period of his professional career was the interval between the alert arriving and the rescue team's confirmation that there was one survivor in the rear service corridor. I told him I was grateful for that. He was quiet for a moment, then he said that Orvath Station's purpose, the entire point of its existence and its administration, was to be a place where conversations that could not happen anywhere else could happen here, that the platform's value was entirely contingent on the parties who came to it engaging honestly with what it was for. He said the events of the summit had been the most direct challenge to that purpose in the station's operational history, and that he had spent the weeks afterward genuinely uncertain whether the purpose could survive. I asked him what had changed his assessment. He told me about the 3 requests that had come in during the 2 months following the incident. 3 different species with their own bilateral disputes and their own need for neutral ground had contacted the station and asked to use its facilities, not a different neutral platform, Orvath specifically. He said, I think they came here because something true happened here, not a comfortable truth, not an easy one, but a genuine one. And I have come to believe that places where genuine things happen acquire a kind of meaning that people recognize even when the genuine thing was hard, maybe especially when it was. I thought about that on the transport back, about what it means for a place to be marked by a genuine thing, and about what people do with places that have been marked about whether truth has a physical address or whether we just need it to sometimes, because we are the kind of beings that need to be able to stand somewhere and feel the weight of what happened there. Back at the assembly liaison facility, I sat down at my desk and took the authorizations chip from my left breast pocket and held it in my palm. It is the size of a thumbnail, smooth on all edges, warm from the heat of the body it travels with. I have carried it since the engineering team removed it from the Orveth terminal log assembly during the post-incident technical analysis and sealed it in a bag with my name on it and gave it to me. I have been asked twice in debriefs whether I intend to keep it, and both times I have said yes and have not been asked to elaborate. I carry it because I want to remember the specific quality of the decision it represents, not the outcome of the decision, though I carry that too in different ways. The decision itself, the 3 seconds at the terminal, the deliberateness, the choice to make a choice rather than an automatic response, the understanding as I pressed the key of what I was doing and why and what it would cost and what it was worth, and that those were not the same calculation, and that Vera Osmondsa had known they were not the same calculation for 40 years and had kept doing the work. Anyway, the Osmondsa framework exists, the ceasefire provisions, the mutual withdrawal protocols, the border monitoring parameters, all of it in the permanent record of the Galactic Observer Assembly and in the active treaty infrastructure between Earth and the K-Theron Hegman. 2 other operations were called off by species that made a private calculation and arrived at a private answer. The patient's doctrine is in the possession of 17 assembly member delegations, shared openly as an honest statement of who humanity is and has built itself to be. The diplomatic architecture initiative has been funded at its highest historical level with a named endowment that will train a generation of people in the specific work that Vera Osmondsa spent 40 years doing and dying for. Both program real, both continue, both express the same thing, which is that humanity values what it says it values and has built what it has built in service of those values, and will be honest about all of it in front of anyone who is watching. That is who we are. It is not who I might wish we could be in some simpler version of this, some version where the continuity architecture never had to function, where the Amaranth Code stayed permanently untyped, where Vera Osmondsa presented her framework to full table and both sides signed it and came home. I wish for that version. I have wished for it 100 times since the chamber floor, but the version that exists is also real, and in the version that exists, the work that Vera did is permanent, and the framework carries her name, and the galaxy knows in the specific and unambiguous way that it did not know before exactly what humanity is. I tell this story in full every time someone asks, because she told me that the full weight of a thing is the only honest way to carry it. She said that summary is what you give people when you want them to move on, and truth is what you give them when you want them to stay with it long enough to understand it. I want people to understand it. She came in peace. She died in peace. We carried what she was carrying. We carry it still.